April 26th edition of Backroads of Illinois with Cesar Delgado. We were Central Illinois agriculture source for Central Illinois and across the Midwest alongside in Central Illinois agriculture. We're glad you're here on the show. I visited with Ed Ossett from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I asked him about Brazil's soybean production from the Canab report. He said yields was down for December, but their harvest season is moving forward with second crop in Brazil since December. You can listen it for full interview on my YouTube channel. Now I am watching the weather in central Illinois near Peoria between Macon. We are going to have heavy rain on this weekend and some severe strong storm on Sunday. I will be watching the full draft on the weekend. I'm an NFL junkie and college football. Otherwise, I have Max Fisher from National Grain and Feeder Association and Jacqueline Holland from Farm Futures on today's program. This time is for your agricultural news on Backroads of Illinois. This weekend is going to be wet and stormy. The cold front is coming in on this weekend. The storm is coming in on the weekend. Crop insurance by Very Farm. The federal crop insurance coverage deadline for last month. But the Farm Bill FISCA about the Farm Bill is working on the crop insurance beforehand. The lawmakers wouldn't be budget for it. Finally, the United States Department of Agricultural and Food and Drug Administration. The recognition for pastured milk is safe to drink from the HPI. This is your agricultural news on Backroads of Illinois. We are back with our guest with Max Fisher from National Grain and Feeder Industry and Jacqueline Holland from Farm Futures on Backroads of Illinois from National Grain and Feeder Association in Washington, D.C.
All right. Thanks, Cesar. Glad to be with you.
Welcome to the show. How are you, Max?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I'm Max Fisher, the chief economist and treasurer for the National Grain and Feed Association.
Let's start with our conversation about the grain shortage in Ukraine and the Black Sea. Tell our audience about it.
So the war's been going on now for a couple years between Ukraine and Russia. When it first broke out, there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty about grain supply for the whole world because Ukraine is a major supplier of wheat and corn, especially. And within for those who watch commodity futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, we went for quite a ride. Several days of market up limit movements. The market can only move so much in each day, and it was moving that amount for many days in a row. And just because of the uncertainty. So we're a couple years in now, so we have the benefit of hindsight. And what we're seeing is that Ukraine's production for grain is roughly off by about 1/3 from where it had been pre-war. So Ukraine hasn't gone to zero, but they are only producing about 2/3 of what they used to produce. Being a major supplier, that's still a large amount. However, Russia has nearly filled that 1/3 loss in Ukraine's production, especially in wheat, all by themselves. Russia's wheat production has has expanded quite a bit over the last couple of years. So they're filling the void in the wheat market that was left. And then in the corn space, down in South America, Brazil and Argentina, they've ramped up, corn production. And, a lot of that corn gap has also been filled, by other countries in the world. So, so we're to a point now to where a lot of that gap left by Ukraine has been taken care of, and you're seeing that in the marketplace where we're having lower commodity prices now than where we were at, say, a year or two ago. So that's kind of at a very high level what's happened in Ukraine.
Yes, sir, it is pretty crazy for right now with the commodity prices in Chicago, especially on the wheat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So wheat bottomed out probably a couple weeks ago, and it's actually started to come. Kansas City wheat, anyway, it started to come back. Anyway, there is a pretty major drought going on in the grain, in the plains area of the United States, and that's probably part of the reason why we're seeing wheat bounce back right now. But it's still not near where it was price wise to say 2 years ago.
Max, what are you watching about the geopolitics on the grain and feeder industry?
I guess since we were talking about Ukraine, that's definitely still there. If Ukraine were able to drive, the Russians out and, regain their industry, obviously then we would have a situation where we would probably go to, more of a surplus situation where if we were to regain that 1/3 production that they've lost. So, I mean, that's something that everyone has to watch. It's very slow moving, but, hopefully eventually that does happen to where, Ukraine can, regain what it had before, as far as just not being under attack, of course, by Russia. Also, China is such a major player, in the world. Everyone's always watching China, seeing what they're going to do. So, we had the trade war a few years ago. That was major news, really impacted the marketplace. Essentially lost the China market for, it was approximately a year. Maybe it was longer. But felt like a long time. With the presidential election coming up, there's talk about, a potential 10% tariff, on all imports coming into the United States. And, if that were to happen, how would countries like China react? Would they try to take it out on U.S. agriculture, for example, and, go back to a situation where China is not importing from the United States? We have been kind of watching China, increase its imports from our competitors, such as, Brazil, especially in the soybean place, as much as possible, even in corn now too. So China gets definitely a large share of the attention just because of what a large ag market it is. As far as geopolitics, we're also watching the EU. They're putting out some deforestation rules. This would largely impact, imports of, soybean meal. Clearly probably intended, for the Amazon area in Brazil, but it would also apply to the United States. And so a lot of questions right now in the U.S. about how the U.S. will, I guess, how they will comply with these new rules that are coming out of Europe to be able to continue to export to Europe, some of these soybeans and soybean meal especially. So those are probably, and then of course can't forget about the Suez Canal, off the coast of Israel, just especially U.S. flagships. It's very dangerous for them to go through there. for fear of being shot at. So, just adding some extra costs for cargo to have to go around Africa instead of cutting through that canal. So, anyway, yeah, still, those are probably the main things that come to my mind anyway, Cesar.
China wanted to have soybeans from Brazil for right now alongside with the BRICS.
Bring in Brazilian corn, especially if it's cheaper, because you know price price still matters the most. It may be that China, maybe they want to strategically, I don't know, maybe it makes more sense for them strategically to try to bring in ag crops, let's say from Brazil or the United States, if for some reason they view that as like due to like that geopolitical reasons. Still price matters, and if China is price sensitive, and they will want to bring it in from whoever is cheapest under normal situations. So I think they're still going to want U.S. corn. And then with respect to like soybeans, we've seen that China continues to need a tremendous amount of soybeans. So they're going to, true, most of it will come from Brazil, but they're still going to need, a fair amount from the United States. Wheat, that's, truly like a world crop, lots of different producers of wheat, lots of different options there. So United States will continue to be a major exporter of wheat, I believe. But going to lots of different places. And, with India, I remember you mentioned India. That's a market, obviously enormous population there, lots of potential, especially as they become more affluent. So it's hard to tell. I don't necessarily think that India will develop the same way that China has developed. They've, for example, Hinduism there, and so you may not see as much meat consumption there as what you've seen in China. India also, has a lot of protection, as far as energy consumption in this country. Clearly a large push to electrify, and that has a lot of impacts. Clearly for coal, big impact there as we go to more renewables for electricity generation, but also just for like the electricity consumption part, or just energy consumption part. With respect to our fleet of automobiles. In the past, we've relied on the combustion engines, which run on gasoline, diesel, and then also your biofuels. And as the fleet turns over and turns more, I'd say that biofuel space is really, that's the clear area within the next 10 years where things are going to change. I'm sure I'm missing things. It's can't see it all, but that's an area for sure.
Do you have any final thoughts about these issues in the industry?
Just for the industry at large, we're just incredibly blessed in this country to have the amount of prime farmland that we do. I mean, there's literally like 3 areas, maybe 4, in the world that have large tracts of good farmland. We're talking South America, right where we're at, especially the Corn Belt area in the United States. And then of course over in the Black Sea area, and then Europe, and we're just very fortunate that we happen to have that. And then we have, we've put in policies in place in our country, and we've got the free markets, so our ag industry has grown up. to be able to take, the abundance that's produced from our land and turn it into, usable food, fuels, name it, for the rest of the world. So, anyway, we're just very lucky to have that in our country. It's going to continue to, help support the United States for years to come. And anyway, just don't want to lose sight of just how fortunate we are in this country to have, both the resources plus the government structure that allows us to efficiently utilize them. So that's, I guess, the last thing I'd like to share. Cesar.
Thanks, Max. My pleasure that you joined the show for today. Thanks.
Hey,
You're
thanks for having
welcome
me.
to join the show anytime.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Cesar.
This is Max Fisher from National Grain and Feeder Industry in Washington, D.C. Welcome back with Jacqueline Holland from Farm Futures, part of Farm Progress. How are you doing, Jacqueline?
I'm doing good, Caesar. It's great to be back and talking markets with you again.
Let's start with our conversation about the CONAB report from Brazil's Agricultural Agency. What is your sources for Brazil's soybean production? Could you tell our audience?
Yeah, the CONAB report seems to be a topic of hot discussion in the grain trading world these days. And a bit of background on that. So CONAB or CONABE typically releases its forecast a few hours before the WASDE reports each month. And on this latest round, CONABE's soybean harvest was projected at 5.383 billion bushels. And just for perspective, that's about 312 million fewer bushels than what USDA came out and kept their forecast unchanged at after that WASDE report came out of a few hours after that. So there's a lot of discussion amongst the traders why there is such a big disparity between these two figures. And, granted, we got to remember this crop is still being harvested. We haven't been able to reconcile it with exports and with usage just yet. So we're not necessarily married to the totals just yet. And it's also worth noting that historically, CONABE production estimates aren't always reconciled against their export shipping paces in Brazil. So there have been situations where it appears that Brazil is exporting more crops than what CONABE may have indicated was produced. And it's just kind of a difference in some of their data methodology and collection practices that can cause that. I've spoken with reporters and traders who have a presence in Brazil. They've told me that they don't think CONABE starts with a high enough, has a high enough starting acreage to account for all the additional acres that come online in Brazil every year. So that's that's kind of, those are my insights about why we are seeing these big differences. The markets, I think there'll eventually be some smoothing between these two estimates. But I tend to rely a little bit more heavily on USDA's forecasts than the CONABE estimates for Brazil's soybean production.
Their partnership between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and CONABE just make sure.
Can you repeat that question for me, please, Caesar?
Their partnership between the U.S. Department of Agricultural and Conva just make sure.
I know that USDA works with a lot of they work with a lot of foreign countries' state agriculture departments. But just because they work together, it doesn't necessarily mean that they use the same data collection and data analysis methods. So there's and not every country has the same amount of resources as USDA. So some of those discrepancies also account for why we're seeing this big disparity between these two estimates. USDA's estimates come online so quickly after CONABE's, and that USDA's estimates typically utilize they have more resources at their disposal to conduct a lot of the analysis that's required to figure out these production estimates. I typically rely a little bit more heavily on the USDA figures. And just based on what I see from price movement following the report's release, I would say that traders generally rely on USDA data a little bit more heavily than the CONABE numbers.
Okay. Thanks for the information. Next question is Jacqueline. Talk me about the beans markets after the close. Soybean markets are lower for this week. However, this market is going to be down for next couple months.
Yes, so soybean futures, the contracts for about the next marketing year, all traded down about 1 to 4 cents per bushel today. We saw the most actively traded July 24 contract drop down to $11 and about $78 per bushel today. And 78 cents per bushel today, excuse me. And new crop November 24 prices fell to just shy of $11.75 per bushel today. And a lot of what we saw during today's trading session was some hangover weakness from yesterday's lackluster export sales report. I think the market is also looking at some of those the few new crop year export orders that have been booked or have not been booked. Those figures at this point in the marketing year are about 50% lower than they were the same time last year. So the concerns about U.S. export prospects is definitely weighing on the soybean complex today. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the opposite side of that, you have, Brazil and Argentina are both in their peak harvesting periods right now. That's also kind of weighing heavily on the soybean complex. The good news, the only silver lining that I could really derive from today's trading session was that losses were limited by weekend showers that are expected to slow planting in the US, as well as some showers in Brazil that could slow down harvesting some of those late planted soybeans that went in just a little bit behind schedule due to the dry weather in the region last fall.
Not good for this week. It's been crazy week for the beans markets.
Yeah, it has been. I think we're gonna see that. I think we're gonna see a lot of continued weakness just from those strong Brazilian exports over the next few months. And really for the next couple weeks until we can see where this US crop is going to get started and if we can bring any additional soybean acreage in to the fold or not.
How do you see impacting the export to China from Brazil for right now alongside with the beans markets? Could you explain to our listeners about these things?
Yeah, of course. So right now, US soybean export prices are running about 41 cents per bushel higher than Brazil soybean export prices, and just about 57 cents per bushel higher than Argentina's. Plus, US freight costs are higher than what freighters out of Brazil and Argentina can offer. And we have a strong dollar that is also preventing US soybeans from being more competitively priced with South American supplies. So I think it was last fall when Brazil overtook the US as the larger supplier of soybeans to China. And just based on how high our soybean prices are relative to South America's right now, I anticipate that China is going to continue buying heavily from Brazil. I do kind of question, for how long that's going to last. We know that the Chinese economy is still struggling. Consumers are pulling back on spending as well as restaurant eating due to their economic woes. So, I think for the time being, Brazil's soybean exports to China are going to remain pretty strong. I'll just be kind of curious to see when and where the music ends on that parade.
I understand now alongside with US dollar due to the pandemic.
The stronger US dollar isn't necessarily tied back to a lot of direct pandemic effects. I would say the stronger US dollar is more of a reflection of some of the increased international turmoil we've seen over recent months. The dollar is a safe haven asset. So if global investors are worried about conflicts like what we've seen in the Middle East and in the Red Sea over the last couple months, then they're going to move their money into the dollar because there's more of a guarantee of a positive return there for them. So a lot of what we're seeing is that international uncertainty, the geopolitical instability, and I mentioned some of China's economic problems. Here in the US, our GDP was a lot lower than expected in the first quarter of 2024. So, yesterday we saw a bit of a stock market sell off due in large part to that. And when investors get nervous, they decide to move their money towards the dollar, which is good for the dollar, except it makes US grain exports more expensive overseas. So it's it's definitely been a constraint for U.S. Uh, grain and oilseed exporters for sure.
Yes, I agree. With wars and inflation, with the spending bill in Washington, D.C. Do you have any final thoughts on Brazilian production and world events? Planting season.
Yep, I've heard that Brazilian safrino corn crops are looking good. The next few weeks are leading into peak pollination stages for those corn crops in Brazil. They've enjoyed widespread showers over the last week or so, but forecasters are calling for above average warmth across Brazil's corn growing regions for the first half of May. And while those first couple weeks of May are expected to feature rain surpluses for southern Brazil, the big growing areas in Mato Grosso are more likely to remain dry. So I'm keeping an eye on that. There's a lot more to keep track of in the Middle East this year than we've seen in previous years, as well as, kind of some shifts in military tactics in the Ukraine and Russian conflict. And of course, planting is really starting to reach its peak in the Midwest. It looks like it's going to be a really rainy weekend, but my folks up in northern Illinois, northwestern Illinois, have said that they just finished planting oats and alfalfa, and they've seen a lot of planters racing across the fields in recent days. So it'll be interesting to see crop progress reports on Monday to see how much corn and soybeans have gone into the ground this week before all of these heavy rains come this weekend.
Crazy stuff going on for right now. Jacqueline.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thanks for having me, Cesar. It's always great to visit with you.
This is Jacqueline Holland from Farm Futures for Farm Progress. We were coming back with our last segment on back roads of Illinois. Welcome to the show. Thanks to Max Fisher from National Feed and Grain and Jacqueline Holland from Farm Futures on today's program. You can subscribe to the show on YouTube and whenever you are getting to your podcast. Thanks to listen on today's show for Back Roads of Illinois. I am Cesar Delgado. Have a good weekend.